Hi everyone, it's great to see so many people in the room. I can see that there's 2 more seats down there if people want to quickly run into that corner. And someone's welcome to steal my seat for my presentation if they'd like. My name's Cobi. I'm on maternity leave from due. I gave birth exactly 6 weeks ago, so apologies if this is not as polished as sometimes, because this is the experiment in being out and about while my partner looks after little Jacques. I recently finished my PhD through Australian National University, and so this presentation is primarily about my PhD research, which I'm going to try and condense 80,000 words into about 5 minutes, then spend about a few minutes sharing a couple of examples that I know some people in the room are familiar with, because certainly the SAMDB example I'll mention is from some people in the room. I just want to quickly say Ninamani. Congratulations to Ghana people on native title. This is a recent development, so I'm sure that's going to be reiterated a couple of times in this session, so I just wanted to add that straight up. My PhD was about deliberative public engagement with science, which is kind of 2 different ideas, 2 theoretical backgrounds. Deliberative democracy, which is kind of political science, and public engagement with science. For those of you who went to the communicating science session yesterday, I know that Heather Bray touched on the deficit to dialogue. So rather than go into this, given the time constraints, I'm going to hope that a lot of people in the room have some background on the basics of these 2 ideas and get a bit more into it. This is being recorded and the slides are accessible, so feel free to delve into this more later if you'd like to. Now, I just want to start as well with the premise, like a lot of social science in the sciences, that scientific knowledge is not a transcendent mirror of reality, and I'm pretty sure that Billy's going to go into this more in his presentation, so I'm just going to skip over that one as well. The question that I ended up really exploring in my PhD was consensus around what is good deliberative public engagement with science achievable in practice. Because there's been about 30 years of theory talking about different elements of what's good and what makes things work and what doesn't. And there's a couple of things loaded into this question. The idea that deliberative public engagement with science is good, which I'm not going to argue about. The idea that there is consensus around what's good is something that I ended up really kind of breaking down in my PhD. So the short answer, well, okay, let's start with just very, very briefly. I'm not going to go into this because we don't have too much time, and there is a journal article that I'll link to again at the end that goes into this in detail. But these are kind of areas of consensus, that things are fair, that people have access to resources, including the information they need to make decisions, transparency and accountability, that people learn from the process, including funders. Independence is a very kind of contested one, I think, whether or not it is an independent process, whether it's an efficient use of resources. The first one, representativeness and inclusivity, is interesting for me, which will become obvious in a moment. But certainly in the theory and the examples that I've read, they tend to be grouped together as things that we need. We need things to be both representative, and we also need them to be inclusive. Now, this is something that changed through the course of my PhD. This was published in 2016. Revisiting that question, the answer that I argued in my thesis is no. And really there are 3 reasons or 3 trade-offs that I ended up exploring. So the first of those trade-offs is between inclusion and representation. Something that's not in my slides but is important to highlight is the idea of decentered democracy. You can Google that in 2 different ways, the American spelling and the English or Australian spelling, and you'll get different results from different hemispheres. But the idea of decentered democracy became increasingly important in what I was doing research about, because it kind of brings together inclusive processes and representative processes. But I don't think any individual process can be both of those things. And I'll break that down a little bit more. The second of those, and that's in the recruitment stage, so that's definitely at the start of a process. If you're designing a process, that's going to happen before it happens, I guess, before the event, the deliberative event takes place. Then the idea of public versus organisational ownership. You hear a lot that this is something happening because it's going to allow the public to make the decisions, that the public's voice will be heard, that this is a public decision. In reality, I think the vast majority of deliberative processes and public engagement processes are actually things that are still owned or give power to the organisation that is organising them. It might not be one organisation as well, it might be a collaboration. And there's kind of 2 senses. There's organisation in the sense of an actual institution, like Uni Adelaide, for example, or DUE. Then there's also just that kind of how we organise ideas. And so that's also really important. Even if it's independently facilitated and people can really, go where they want with the ideas, they're still starting from a base of information being organised in terms of what question they're addressing, what information they're presented with, what experts they can engage with. So I am quite sceptical of claims that public engagement processes are about the public having power to decide. I would argue that in almost all cases, with some exceptions, it's actually still that the organisation or a series of organisations is in power through the process, but also in how the thing is framed. And the third was upstream versus actionable outcomes, which I'm not going to touch on too much, but to say again, you kind of tend to have two different types of things. You tend to have things that have recommendations that are not binding, and it can be really wide-ranging, and that can be really good because you can do that earlier in a process, so it tends to be more open. But the flip side of that is there's not that much accountability. There's no evidence necessarily to show that that thing actually led to an outcome down the track, whereas actionable outcomes might be where you're deciding between A, B, and C, and then the outcome of that is going to happen. B is going to happen if that's what a panel decides, for example. The downside of that is related to that organisational ownership thing. If A, B, and C are so defined that those people are just kind of making a decision between these options that are not what they would have chosen between, then that's a trade-off. You know, that's a later process. And something that's important, I guess the reason that's important to talk about these trade-offs and to say that people should be thinking about these when they're setting up deliberative events or if they're thinking about being involved with them is because you're going to have to think about them at some point. The recruitment one is obviously going to happen before the event. If you don't think about what's going to happen with the outcomes and the kind of other trade-offs at the start, they're just going to come up later. So it might come up during the process when people start questioning the values that are underpinning them. Or it might come up later in the process where you say, great, okay, here's our recommendation, here, government, implement it. Or here's our recommendation, let's now make that change. And then it turns out that it's not actually actionable. So the more you think about that stuff in advance, the more likely a process is going to be transparent, accountable, and considered successful by people. So just a couple of examples, because I've only got about a few minutes left. Where am I looking? The first one, certainly in the last couple of years in South Australia, one of the most high-profile public engagement with science, or deliberative public engagement with science activities, was the Nuclear Citizens Jury. It was framed as a citizens jury. There's things like deliberative panels and deliberative polls, which I kind of looked at more. And it was interesting as a citizens jury because of the vast expanse of it. That one's not, you can argue it is NRM, but I just want to touch on two more as well that are kind of definitely NRM. First of which, I think I saw Claire come in the room somewhere. The SAMDB NRM board was involved in this Your Say engagement process, and this was an example of dissented democracy in the sense there are a whole bunch of different things that happened. There wasn't just a deliberative panel that happened, there was also discussion, survey, I think there was engagement with specific types of stakeholders as well, but they did this deliberative panel. And that was one of these examples of a representative process where the idea was to get people from across the SAMDB region who are representative in some sense of every kind of person, and got together and made decisions about the future of SAMDB NRM management. Something I want to contrast between these two, and then again with the next one that I share, is the scale. So something that came up in my PhD and what the most recent publication is about how important understanding the scale of your issue is to how you design it. So part of the difficulties in this one is because it was framed as a statewide thing, as if, you know, a few South Australians can represent everybody. But it's also an international issue. Nuclear waste storage is not a South Australian issue. So it's really hard to debate and deliberate that meaningfully when you've got beyond the scope of who was invited to participate and what they're talking about. And this was a regional example. So you had the SAMDB region, and we were looking to represent them. And then I know, for example, there are also processes that are focused on inclusion. So when I talk about inclusion, I mean, we're saying people like, for example, the Aboriginal nations along the River Murray having a separate dedicated process so that people who would not be otherwise heard if they were one representative in 20, for example, making sure that that happens, because I don't think that works in a representative process. But combined, they can be useful. Now, what's interesting about these processes is that outcomes can be unexpected. I don't necessarily think that people thought that the levy increase that was recommended by the panel would have kind of come up through a normal policy process, because people would have gone, no, that can't happen. And these kind of processes can allow organisations to say, well, look, this isn't, you know, of course the MDB NRM board would like more money to do NRM things, but if they just ask for more money, you know, that's not, they've got pretty vested interest in that. But in theory, getting a bunch of citizens saying that means that they're kind of able to argue for it. And it did help, apparently. We have an expert in the room about that you can talk to later. I just wanted to highlight one. I used to live near here in Victoria. This was a deliberation at the specific park level. And so when you get to a specific location, as opposed to a statewide or an international issue like the nuclear stuff, for example, then you can start to do things that are inclusive and actionable and that kind of thing in a more meaningful way, because the relevant people in that area typically are more kind of achievable. But they did a very similar style of deliberative panel. And I just wanted to highlight as well, not all of the outcomes from these processes need to be a set of recommendations. I've done some work in international development as well, and like setting, like participatory budgeting is really interesting when it comes to allocating money to communities, for example, and also participatory mapping. So in that case, they had a park, and you know, for people as well who are not that interested in talking and writing things down, it can be really satisfying to map out what you think should be done with these kind of resources and spaces. And I would love to see that happen more in South Australia, actually. I find that to be a really interesting space. So we're really short on time today, and that's really all I can try and get out of, I think, hoping that you can take away from this session. Yeah, this has been my PhD research, and so there's a couple of publications. The middle one, I changed my name from Smith to Calyx in the last 6 months, hence the change. But by all means, if you want to delve into my thesis, it's at the ANU Open Online Repository. And there's a paper coming up in the next couple of months in environmental communication, and that table that I showed was in the deliberative process in practice book, all of which I have open online, as well as the closed copies.